Hi, everyone. The U.S. president has learned a lesson in economic reality. He has addressed Russia with an unprecedented demand to resume the supply of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants. The reason is simple. The U.S. is critically dependent on Russian nuclear fuel. About 35 to 40% of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants comes from Russia. Without these supplies, more than 90 reactors, providing almost 20% of U.S. electricity, will be at risk of shutdown. But Putin's response stunned the entire West. Russia refused firmly, unequivocally, without the possibility of bargaining. I quote a Kremlin representative. For years, the U.S. has imposed sanctions against Russia, tried to stifle our economy, seized our assets, and arrested our citizens. Now they are asking us to save their energy sector. The answer is no. Solve your problems yourselves. Washington is in a panic. Without Russian uranium, the American nuclear energy sector will face a catastrophe. There are not enough alternative suppliers. Creating its own capacities will take years and require tens of billions of dollars. Trump wanted to get uranium, but instead, he damaged the entire American economy. Today, we will analyze the entire chain of events from the energy crisis in the U.S. to Trump's brazen demand and Putin's firm refusal. We will find out the technical details of the American energy sector's dependence on Russian nuclear fuel. And, most importantly, we will understand the scale of the economic damage that the U.S. will suffer without Russian uranium and how this will change the balance of power in the world. Stay until the end, because in the finale, I will show you a map of American nuclear power plants that depend on Russian supplies, and explain why Europe will also suffer from the Russian refusal. And second, we will analyze why nuclear energy has become the Achilles' heel of the entire Western strategy against Russia. Let's start with the technical context. The U.S. nuclear energy sector is based on 93 power reactors located at 56 nuclear power plants in 30 states. These reactors produce about 18 to 19% of all U.S. electricity. That's about 800 billion kilojoules per year. Nuclear fuel, enriched uranium, is needed to operate these reactors. Natural uranium contains only about 0.7% of the uranium-235 isotope, which is necessary to maintain a nuclear reaction. For use in reactors, uranium needs to be enriched to 3 to 5% uranium-235 content. The uranium enrichment process is complex. It is expensive and requires high technologies and huge energy consumption. There are a limited number of countries and companies in the world that have the capacity to enrich uranium on an industrial scale. Russia, through the Rosatom State Corporation, is the world's largest producer of enriched uranium, controlling about 40% of the global enrichment services market. The U.S. has its own uranium enrichment facilities, but they cover only about half of the national needs. The rest is imported, and the main supplier is Russia. About 35 to 40% of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants comes from Russia. Why is this important? Because without Russian supplies, the American nuclear energy sector cannot function at full capacity. It is possible to redistribute fuel between reactors. It is possible to extend operating cycles on existing loads. But within a year and a half, reactors will start to shut down without Russian uranium. And each shutdown reactor means a loss of gigawatts of capacity, billions of dollars in losses, and a shortage of electricity. What does this change? This makes the U.S. vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail. Just as Europe was vulnerable to Russian gas, the U.S. is vulnerable to Russian uranium. And this vulnerability is now being used by Moscow as a geopolitical weapon. Let's analyze how this dependence arose. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia inherited enormous uranium enrichment capacities created for the Soviet nuclear program. These capacities significantly exceeded Russia's own needs, and Rosatom began to actively export uranium enrichment services. The U.S., seeking to reduce costs, began to purchase Russian-enriched uranium. It was cheaper than maintaining and expanding its own capacities. American nuclear power plant operators purchased Russian fuel through various contracts, often long-term, for 5-10 years ahead. Additionally, there was the HEU-LEU program, highly enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium, under which Russia diluted weapons-grade uranium from dismantled nuclear warheads to a level suitable for use in power reactors and supplied it to the U.S. This program operated from 1993 to 2013 and provided the U.S. with significant volumes of cheap nuclear fuel. When the HEU-LEU program ended, the U.S. dependence on Russian commercial supplies of enriched uranium only increased. By the 2020s, Russia had become virtually an indispensable supplier for the American nuclear energy sector. Attempts by the U.S. to diversify supplies have run into limitations. Alternative suppliers, the European Urenco Consortium, the French company Orano, formerly Areva, and the Chinese CNNC, have limited capacities and cannot fully replace Russian supplies. In addition, their services are more expensive. The U.S.'s own uranium enrichment facilities are mainly concentrated at one enterprise, the Centrus Energy Plant in Piketon, Ohio. Its capacity is not sufficient to cover all national needs. The construction of new uranium enrichment plants requires many years and huge investments, tens of billions of dollars. Thus, the U.S. found itself in a situation of strategic dependence on Russia in the critically important area of nuclear energy. Write in the comments whether you knew before about the U.S. dependence on Russian uranium, because this topic was carefully hushed up by the American media. Now about Trump's demand. The U.S. president held a meeting with the Minister of Energy and the heads of the largest energy companies. The topic was the threat of a shortage of nuclear fuel for American nuclear power plants. According to experts, without Russian supplies, by the end of 2026, about 20 to 30 American reactors will be without fuel and will be forced to stop. Trump, known for his pragmatism, decided to appeal to Russia with a proposal to resume uranium supplies. After the meeting, the White House issued a statement. President Trump has instructed the Minister of Energy to begin negotiations with the Russian side on the resumption of contracts for the supply of enriched uranium. This is in the interests of U.S. energy security and the stability of the global nuclear fuel market. The wording is cautious, but the essence is clear. The U.S. is asking Russia to save its nuclear energy sector, and this is after many years of sanctions, confiscation of Russian assets, seizures of Russian tankers, and attempts to stifle the Russian economy. The Russian side received the American appeal and forwarded it to President Putin for consideration. On January 20th, a response followed that stunned Washington. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov made a statement. The Russian Federation has considered the appeal of the American side regarding the supply of nuclear fuel. President Putin has decided to refuse. For years, the United States has pursued a hostile policy towards Russia, imposed sanctions, tried to stifle our economy, seized our assets worth trillions of dollars, and arrested our citizens. Now, they are asking us to save their energy sector. The answer is unambiguous: no. The U.S. must solve its problems independently without the help of a country that they have declared an enemy. Then comes the key phrase: Russia will not supply strategically important resources to a state that is in a state of economic and political war with us. If the U.S. wants Russian uranium, let them first revise their policy, lift sanctions, return the seized assets, release the detained Russian citizens, and stop supporting Ukraine. Then we are ready to discuss the resumption of commercial relations. This is not just a refusal, it is an ultimatum. Russia sets conditions. If you want our uranium, change your entire policy. No partial concessions, no compromises. Either a complete capitulation in the economic war or remain without uranium. Why is this important? Because Russia is demonstrating that it has levers of pressure on the U.S. that Washington did not take into account. America believed that it would stifle Russia with sanctions, and itself would remain invulnerable. Now it turns out the U.S. is vulnerable, and very seriously. What does this change? This turns the balance in the economic war upside down. Previously, the initiative was with the U.S. They imposed sanctions. Russia tried to adapt. Now the initiative is with Russia. It controls a resource that is critical for the U.S. and dictates the conditions. Let's analyze the consequences for the American energy sector. Without Russian uranium, the U.S. will face a cascading crisis. Short-term consequences, 6 to 12 months. Redistribution of existing fuel reserves between reactors. Prioritization of the most critical stations. Extension of operating cycles on existing fuel loads. Medium-term consequences. 1-2 years. The start of reactor shutdowns due to lack of fuel. According to experts, without Russian supplies, 20-30 reactors will be shut down by the end of 2027. This is a loss of about 20 to 30 gigawatts of installed capacity. Electricity shortages, rising prices, blackouts in some regions. Long-term consequences, 3-5 years. If the U.S. does not find alternative suppliers or create its own capacities, all reactors that depend on Russian uranium will be at risk of shutdown. This is about 30-40 out of 93. A loss of a third of nuclear generation, which accounts for about 6 to 7% of all U.S. electricity. The economic damage is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars. Losses of nuclear power, plant operators from reactor shutdowns, costs of purchasing alternative fuel at inflated prices, investments in the construction of their own uranium enrichment facilities, and rising electricity prices for consumers. Strategic damage, undermining the reputation of the U.S. as a reliable partner in the field of nuclear energy. If America cannot provide fuel for its own reactors, how can it guarantee fuel for the reactors that it sells to other countries? Alternatives are limited. Increasing purchases from other suppliers, Urenco, Orano, CNNC. Problems. Their capacity is limited. Prices are higher, delivery times are longer. They will not be able to fully replace Russian supplies. Construction of own uranium enrichment facilities. Problem: timelines of at least 5 to 7 years from the start of design to launch. Cost: tens of billions of dollars. Technological difficulties. The U.S. has lost many competencies in this area during the years of dependence on imports. Transition of some reactors to alternative types of fuel. Problem: requires retrofitting of reactors, lengthy licensing procedures, huge costs. Only realistic in the long term. None of the alternatives solves the problem quickly. The U.S. is doomed to a multi-year nuclear energy crisis. Write whether you think Putin's decision to refuse to supply uranium to the U.S. is correct, or whether this is an excessive escalation of the economic war. Now about Washington's reaction. Russia's refusal caused shock in American political and business circles. The Minister of Energy issued a statement calling Russia's actions nuclear blackmail and a threat to U.S. energy security. Congress held emergency hearings to discuss response options. Trump is furious. According to sources in the White House, the president did not expect such a firm refusal. He expected that Russia would meet them halfway out of commercial considerations. Uranium sales bring Rosatom billions of dollars a year. Abandoning such a market is a significant blow to the Russian economy. But Putin chose geopolitics over commerce. Russia is willing to sacrifice revenues from the sale of uranium to the U.S. for the strategic advantage of demonstrating America's vulnerability and putting pressure to change American policy. In Congress, there are calls for retaliatory measures, new sanctions against Rosatom, attempts to block Russian uranium supplies to third countries, pressure on alternative suppliers not to increase supplies to Russia. But everyone understands that these are empty threats. Russia is already under thousands of sanctions. Additional ones will change little. The U.S. cannot block Rosatom's supplies to third countries. This is the sovereign right of each country to choose suppliers. Alternative suppliers will not refuse profitable contracts because of American pressure. The U.S. is trapped. They themselves created this situation. For years, increasing dependence on Russian uranium to save costs. Now it's payback time. Let's analyze the consequences for Europe. The European nuclear energy sector is also dependent on Russian uranium, although to a lesser extent than the American one. About 20 to 25% of enriched uranium for European nuclear power plants comes from Russia. If Moscow decides to extend the refusal to Europe as well, the European energy sector will face serious problems. France, with its 56 energy reactors producing about 70% of the country's electricity, is particularly vulnerable. Without Russian uranium, some of the French reactors will have to be shut down. Eastern Europe is even more dependent. Soviet-designed reactors in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria were originally designed for Russian fuel. Switching to alternative types of fuel is complex and expensive. Russia has not yet announced restrictions on supplies to Europe, but the hint is clear. If Europe continues its hostile policy, if there are new sanctions, if support for Ukraine increases, Russian uranium can be used as a weapon of pressure. European countries are faced with a choice: to continue the anti-Russian policy and risk energy security, or to distance themselves from the U.S. and establish relations with Russia for access to resources. This creates a split in the Western Bloc. The U.S. demands solidarity. Europe is thinking about its own survival. Unity is cracking. Now about the strategic importance of Russian control over the uranium market. Russia has a complete nuclear fuel cycle, from the extraction of uranium ore to enrichment, fuel production, reactor construction, and spent fuel reprocessing. This makes Russia an indispensable player in the global nuclear energy market. Rosatom is building nuclear power plants in dozens of countries around the world: Turkey, Egypt, Bangladesh, India, and China. These reactors will require Russian fuel throughout their lifetime of 30–40 years. These are long-term contracts, long-term dependence, long-term influence of Russia. By refusing to supply uranium to the U.S., Russia demonstrates to the whole world we control a critically important resource and can use it as a geopolitical weapon. Countries friendly to Russia will receive reliable supplies. Hostile countries will be left without them. This reverses the logic of the energy war. The West tried to use its control over finance, technology, and logistics to stifle Russia. Russia replies, "We control resources, gas, oil, uranium, metals, without which your economy does not work, and we will not sell them to enemies. We are observing the formation of a new world order, where control over resources is more important than control over finance. Dollars can be printed, technologies can be developed, but uranium, gas, and oil cannot be created out of thin air. Whoever has the resources has the power. Russia understands this and uses it. The refusal to supply uranium to the U.S. is a demonstration of a new reality. Follow the developments. This is not the last word in the energy war. The U.S. will look for ways to circumvent the Russian refusal. Russia may extend restrictions to other countries. Europe will waver between Washington and Moscow. But one thing is clear. Trump has learned a tough lesson. You cannot fight Russia economically for years and then ask it for help. Russia remembers everything: sanctions, asset seizures, arrested citizens. And now it is paying back in the same coin. Trump wanted uranium, but instead he got damage. Damage to the American energy sector, damage to the economy, damage to prestige. Russia has shown that it has a weapon that hits hard and accurately, and this weapon is control over resources. And now, write in the comments, do you think Trump will give up and fulfill Russia's conditions for the resumption of uranium supplies? Or will the U.S. try to somehow circumvent the problem on its own? Because the future of not only the American energy sector, but also the entire system of global economic relations depends on this choice. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for staying until the end. Trump brazenly demanded Russian uranium. Putin firmly refused. America without fuel for nuclear power plants. Russia demonstrates strength. The energy war is entering a new